Good afternoon. My name is Angela Hsu, and I'm the president of GAPABA, the Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association. We have people from coast to coast joining us today, so it's very exciting. It's a somber anniversary. It's the anniversary of the murder of Vincent Chin, which happened amazingly 39 years ago. His name is synonymous with the effort to root out AAPI hate. And to talk about the history of GAPABA as an organization previous to 2020, we really were primarily a professional organization. We had some fun mixers and events, and we supported our community, but we had a fabulous gala. But I think starting in 2020, we really started to think about our mission, changed our focus a little bit with the social justice movement and Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020, and then the rise of AAPI hate. We really started to reflect on what our mission should be, and then started to make more efforts. And then with the shootings in Atlanta, it really galvanized our community and AAPI communities across the nation, and we really started to take more of a leadership role. So towards that effort, we now have a permanent victims fund up and running, and we're starting to raise funds for that. And we are putting on events like this. So very exciting very excited to have these very, very special panelists with us today. I want to welcome U.S. Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, newly elected in January, who has graciously agreed to join us by video to kick us off.
Good afternoon. This is Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock. And while I wish I could join you live, I'm so thankful that I can join you today virtually as we commemorate a pivotal moment in Asian American history, the 39th anniversary of the tragic killing of Vincent Chin. The tragedy of Chin's death and the apparent failure of our justice system to hold Chin's attackers accountable is what helped spark the modern AAPI civil rights movement decades ago. In real sense, you have taught us how to transform pain into power. You built a movement that, given the recent surge we've seen in violence against Asians, seems just as relevant today. Dr. King reminded us that we are tied in a single garment of destiny, caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so we are in this together. And this tragic anniversary is yet another reminder that we as Georgians, we as Americans, must stand against bigotry and racism at every turn, no matter who the target. History has shown us that the struggles of the AAPI community are a shared experience of the greater social justice movement. Asian Americans and African Americans, and members of all marginalized communities must stand together. In fact, all of us must stand together as we move our country forward. That's why I was proud to co-sponsor and help pass the recent Asian COVID-19 hate crimes bill, introduced by my colleagues, Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii and Representative Grace Ming of New York. Signed into law appropriately during Asian Heritage Month, this law commits federal resources to investigate and report these hate crimes in order to ensure that Asian Americans and every American feel safe in their own country. So thank you so very much for standing up. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. My thanks to GAPABA, President Angela Hsu, and Nagae, Chair and Champion for Justice, to Wong for putting together this expert panel to have this important conversation. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to meet in the future again and again. But until then, keep the faith, keep fighting the good fight, and keep looking up.
Thank you, Senator Warnock, for helping to frame our conversation here today. I think it's an absolute truth that none of us are free until all of us are free. Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Timothy Wong. I am an Associate General Counsel at Delta Airlines and also the President-elect of GAPABA. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to serve as the moderator for this conversation in commemoration of the legacy of Vincent Chin. In 1982, Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old Chinese-American engineer, was brutally attacked with a baseball bat and killed by two disgruntled Detroit auto workers who misidentified Vincent as Japanese and blamed him for taking American jobs. These murderers never spent a single night in jail. Vincent Chin's story and the apparent failure of the justice system to hold his attackers accountable outraged, and rightfully so, the Asian American community and helped spark the modern AAPI civil rights movement, as well as the broader push for stronger federal hate crime legislation for all Americans. While Vincent Chin's story must always be remembered and learned from, in order to prevent history from repeating itself, this year's commemoration is especially important and relevant given the events of the last year and a half. Public scapegoating of Asians for the COVID pandemic, a radical increase in Asian hate incidences from coast to coast, many of them seemingly random and targeting the elderly who are least able to defend themselves. And of course, the horrific shootings in Atlanta on March 16th, resulting in the tragic and senseless death of 8 innocent people, 6 of whom were Asian. Of course, anti-Asian hate and violence, unfortunately, of the last year and the year and a half are not new, but a continuation of anti-Asian hate and violence in this country, really since the moment Asians first stepped foot on this land. I appreciate the optimism and hopefulness of Dr. King's words. The arc of the moral universe is long, he said, but it bends toward justice. But with history repeating itself, it's natural to wonder whether those words ring true for our community. On this 39th anniversary of Vincent Chin's death, we are extraordinarily fortunate and delighted to have with us some of the very brightest and most accomplished people in the country to talk about recent events, where we are as a community and a country, and how we can ensure that the legacy of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the internment of Japanese Americans, Vincent Chin's murder, the Atlanta shootings, and the countless acts of violence, bias, and hate against Asian Americans can and will translate into a movement for real change and not simply singular moments of pain and suffering. So without further delay, let me do a short introduction of our panelists, and then I would ask them to share a few more words about themselves. First, we have with us today Paula Yu. Paula is an award-winning author who recently released From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, The Killing of Vincent Chin, and the trial that galvanized the Asian American movement. And I'm very excited to share that when we say award-winning, she actually just won yet another award today. I'm excited to share that Paula's book was just selected as the winner of this prestigious Boston Globe Horn Book Award. Congratulations, Paula. Next, we have Richard Louie, an award-winning broadcast journalist and anchor for MSNBC and NBC News. He has written his first book, recently published, Enough About Me. And last, but certainly not least, we have Peggy Nagae, who is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, DE&I, and community leader activist. Among her many accomplishments, she was the lead counsel in reopening the landmark Minoru Yasui World War II Japanese curfew case in front of the Supreme Court. Paula, would you like to share a few more things about yourself with our audience?
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and it's a pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel. Just to let you know a little bit more about myself, I write books, as you can see, for children and young adults. I also work in TV as a TV writer producer. That's my day job. And I've written for shows like NBC's The West Wing, all the way up to shows like the CW's Supergirl. And when I'm not writing, I like to play my violin for fun. So kind of do a little bit of freelance music. And I do just want to say that with the books that I write, I've been focusing a lot on Asian American Pacific Islander history, nonfiction, and also just Asian American stories, both in fiction and nonfiction, because it's very important to me, because our history is not taught enough in kindergarten through the 12th grade. And that's what fuels my passion for telling our stories and our history, because our voices matter. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Richard?
Hey, Timothy and GAPABA, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. Although we're on June 2-3, which is a 39th anniversary of the murder of Vincent Chin, this is a moment to really move forward in a thoughtful, energetic, and productive way. So I thank GAPABA, Timothy, and all of the leadership that came together. Angela, for your opening remarks as well, and Jeannie and Bonnie and everybody else that is gathering us today, because this takes time. This takes effort, and that's the only way we're going to move forward. And it's congratulations to Paula as well. When I got the news today, I was like, yoo-hoo! That's actually what I did, by the way. The more books like that written by people of great thought and view and vision, like Paula, is needed. And so I was very, very excited to see the Boston Globe do that. Paula, big ups to you. You know, as a journalist, as I sit here, you know, my first, if you will, civil rights story, and I did not think of myself as a civil rights reporter at the time, was with Rodney King, a black man that was beaten on camera. And as a cub reporter, it was a little bit above my pay grade. And so now, as I sit here many years later and have stood in the streets, and I'll give more detail later, reporting on similar stories that seemed like they were replays in front of my eyes, I knew that remembering all communities, including the AAPI community, the African American community, Latino American community, the LGBTQ community, the Native American community, and others, it's so important for us to see the commonality in the pain, so we can see the commonality in the solutions and the way that we can work together. And if there is a great town that I have always spoken about positively, it is certainly Atlanta's not a town, by the way. So don't take it the wrong way. It is a metropolis, but I say town in an affectionate way here, Timothy. So don't come at me yet. But you know,
No
if there's one, if there is a state that has really seen great growth in the time I was there for just 5 years, it is the state of Georgia. It's the metropolitan area of Atlanta, and it's a great place for intersectional thought and work. And what a better place no better place to talk about the topic we're on today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Peggy?
Thank you, everybody. And again, it's a really pleasure to be here with the panelists, but also for GAPABA putting on this program. I guess two kind of great claims to fame. I was born and raised in Boring, Oregon. It is B-O-R-I-N-G, and it's not an adjective for the state of Oregon. It's a place in Oregon. I was raised on a berry and vegetable farm. We were really poor. I grew up without indoor plumbing, eating government surplus food in the winter, primarily because my parents and all my relatives were incarcerated during World War II. And their incarceration as Japanese Americans really informed a lot of my career and what I've done in terms of justice. And also being born in the 60s had a lot to do with it too. But my second claim to fame is I was a phone banker for the Georgia senatorial runoff. And I've never felt more Georgian, if that's what the word is, but also just more connected to a different part of the country than when I started phone banking. And so it was really a wonderful opportunity. And then I'd say I was the third president of NAPABA and the program director for the Center for Asian Pacific American Women.
Terrific. Thank you. And thanks for sharing the piece about being on the phone banks. We knew there were people all over the country who helped drive that outcome, and we appreciate it. Paula, since it's your big day, I'd like to start with you. Your latest book, your award-winning book, was written for a young adult audience. Could you please describe some of the challenges of trying to present such a complicated, and frankly, such a tragic case as Vincent Chin's to a young adult audience? And given the challenges, can you share with the audience why it was so important for you to do so?
Of course. So this is my book, From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, published by Norton Young Readers, the imprint for W.W. Norton and Company. And I just want to start by saying off that I wrote this book for everyone. I do not sanitize the language. The word mother F word, it's spelled out completely. I do not shy away from the graphic details of the violence that happened during the beating death. And I don't simplify any of the court proceedings. I talk about motions. I talk about indictments, about, plea bargaining, and, which are not that those, at first you think, oh, these are very adult topics. This is very complicated for teenagers, but they're not. Teens are very, very smart. And so I just wanted to say that I wrote this book for everyone. Now, taking a step back, the reason why it is marketed for young adults and teenage and high school students, and the reason why I did write it with that particular audience in mind, is that there are two stories in my book. One is, of course, the story of the life and death and the trial and the legacy of Vincent Chin, which in itself is incredibly compelling and engaging to people of all ages, especially young people. It's an incredible, almost cinematic in the way the story unfolds. But there's a parallel storyline. I happened to find the son of Vicky Wong, Jared Liu. Vicky Wong was Vincent Chin's fiance, and so she eventually moved on with her life and got married and had kids. And I met her oldest son, Jared. So his story is told, and he basically is the guide for the young adult high school student because he's closer to their age. He's a young millennial, and so we get to discover Vincent's story through his eyes, because in the book, it opens with him not even knowing who Vincent Chin was. It was actually the 30th anniversary of Vincent Chin's death in 2012. And his cousin called saying, hey, don't talk to your mom about that guy. It's the big anniversary. And Jared was confused and said, what guy? His cousin said, Vincent Chin. And Jared goes, Vincent who? So then he Googled who Vincent Chin was, and the picture you just saw from the Detroit Free Press, he recognized his mother right away and realized that this was a family secret he had uncovered. So the other part of the book is about Jared building up the courage to talk to his mom about this very painful history and why his generation and future generations should know about this story. So, and as I wrote it, I'm very fair in the book. So, I mean, when I talk about fair, I present both sides of the case because I want teachers and students to pretend as if you're a member of the jury. So how would you, what would you sentence Ronald Ebens and Michael Mitz based on the evidence on both sides? Because it's also about teaching how the courts work and sometimes don't work in our country and what we do to try to fix that. So that's a big part of why this book is especially geared towards the high school audience. And I just want to conclude by saying that a recent statistic came out this year saying that 1 out of 4 Asian American Pacific Islander high school students, the teenagers, have reported being bullied physically and or verbally and harassed because of the coronavirus pandemic. And the reason why I wrote this book was I want books like this, not just by me, but by other really amazing children's book and young adult authors to be taught in our schools, because maybe in the future that number will be 0.
We can all hope for that. And I think I really applaud your effort to reach them, reach children when they're young and impressionable and when they're learning about the world. And what a statistic, although I would say, I think that number has to be an undercount. How many people were embarrassed or thought it wasn't a big deal and shrugged it off. So it breaks my heart to hear that, but thank you for writing this book. Peggy, I'd like to move on to you next. So you mentioned you were the 3rd president of NAPABA, and I think that actually coincided with the 10th anniversary of the Vincent Chin incident, right? And so I know you and a number of influential AAPI leaders visited Detroit on the 10th anniversary. Can you tell us a little bit about that visit and why, I think it's commonly held belief that that was really a turning point or even the beginning of the AAPI civil rights movement in this country?
Thanks, Timothy. I do remember 1982 and Vincent Chin's killing. And I remember, especially because I knew Helen Zia at that time, that there were protests going on. I think that what it did was it galvanized the Asian Pacific American community, at least especially Asian Americans. We might have been more separate, but after especially the sentencing of probation and $3,000 fine, there were protests that were in Detroit, and then they erupted all over the country. And they were Asian Americans coming together to protest what happened to Vincent Chin. And more importantly, when the judge said that the punishment should fit the criminals and not the crime. And so they got 3 years probation and $3,000 fine. That was just outrageous. Those protests forced the Department of Justice to bring a civil rights prosecution against these two people. And it was the first time that Asian Americans were included in the federal civil rights prosecution. Before then, Asian Americans weren't thought to be protected under that. So there was a federal lawsuit brought. It turned out that one was convicted with 25 years of prison. The other was found not guilty, but it was a significant case. And then the third thing that happened was they filed a civil wrongful death act. And that was really important as well, to say that the family deserves a remedy for the killing of their son. So I think for all those three reasons, it really galvanized the Asian American community.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that firsthand account. And I think it does make sense. I think the piece that is perhaps surprising about it is we're talking about 39 years ago, not 139 years ago. But thank you for sharing that, Peggy. Richard, on to you. So tomorrow marks 100 days since the Atlanta March 16th shootings. I understand that you've produced a documentary on the incident that will be released tomorrow. I'm certain that you, as a journalist, kept a close eye on the media's overall handling and coverage of this tragedy. I'm curious about your thoughts on what the media got right, maybe what they could have done better on. For example, have traditional Asian stereotypes crept into any of the reporting? And if so, have you had any opportunities to maybe intervene and try to correct the narrative?
And Timothy, it all comes together as we sit here on the 39th anniversary of Vincent Chin's murder and killing. What inspired me to head to Atlanta for the 100-day mark was exactly that experience that we are talking about today, is the forgetting of what happened on June 23rd, 39 years ago. And its significance, not only to the country, but to our Asian American Pacific Islander community, that would really be our very first civil rights response of any note in U.S. history. And that very tentpole in our American civil rights history was not very well remembered, nor noted, nor worked upon. And I'm not pointing fingers, only to say that we had an opportunity. We had a gap, right? And if that were to be the first, because as we look back, there's been bigger crimes, bigger misgivings to this AAPI community over the last 200 years. It's just that we had been hamstrung in our own civil rights to respond, that Vincent Chin happened to be the first time. There are many incidents before, but it's because we had, as was invoked, folks like Helen Zia and Corky Lee and Tihua Chang, journalists who ran from their coasts and their homes to tell the story of that young man who was beaten with a bat in the street, and you saw his autopsy photos, you could not even recognize that was a human. But we don't tell the story. So that, as I went out to his tombstone on the 35th anniversary, as I went out on the 25th anniversary of his death to Detroit, Michigan, to see what the story was, this was another echo, Atlanta, and Atlanta being that other tent pole, the unfortunate tent pole in our AAPI history. We have no others. These are the two. And so now the question is what we do with what happened in Atlanta. And as a journalist and a person of color, I wanted to make sure to do my darndest to get to Atlanta, my former hometown when I used to work at CNN not too long ago, or maybe too long ago, depending how you count it. But I knew that this could not be forgotten, that we must continue to talk about this second civil rights tentpole in our very, very limited history of being able to respond as a country and as a group that lives in this country. And so Atlanta 100 Days On is a short documentary that we just finished editing, and that is a nightly news film collaboration with NBC Asian America. It's 22 minutes long. It will be launched tomorrow with nightly news films. And here's a little bit of the excerpt. We'll play that, and then I'll just make one last comment.
The mass shootings have triggered a lot of emotion in the Asian American community. Sadness, anger, disbelief.
This has happened to African Americans, to Latinos. This now is happening to Asian Americans.
We have to speak out. We have to act.
Months after the March 16, 2021 attack, it's quiet. Few cars, no people, no reporters, and no flowers or memorials. So, Timothy, that is the name of the short documentary, Remember the Flowers, Atlanta 100 Days On, because we often forget them. And we cannot do that this time. This must be the next tentpole that we move forward. And one way to do it as a storyteller, and Paula, you understand this, is we have to keep on telling it and reminding folks. There are other opportunities to do that, which we can discuss later, but that's why we came out with this nightly news film.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for sharing that. I look forward to watching it, and I know our audience will as well. And I think you're absolutely right that we have to, and this is a theme that's been resonating throughout this conversation already, but we can't let these be isolated moments that are forgotten about until the next tragedy happens. This has to cause permanent and sustained positive change.
And one of those notes, Timothy, really quickly, why 100 Days On, for those who don't know, is that in many Asian cultures, 100 days is that moment where the soul of those who died can finally move on or not. And that's the question, right? As I sat with the families, are the souls moving on or not?
Thank you for sharing that. Paula, back to you. The Georgia Board of Education just passed a resolution banning critical race theory from being taught in public schools in this state. Can you describe the impact you think this might have on our collective ability to teach important lessons about race and about culture? As Richard said, to make sure that it's remembered and that there's action that comes out of these tragic events. And specifically, I know you haven't had a lot of time maybe to process this, but what do you think these types of bans, as they gain steam around the country, how they could impact the ability for, say, a teacher to even use your book as part of the curriculum?
It's a very good question, and I'm trying not to cry after seeing that powerfully beautiful moment in the video, and I cannot wait to see your piece, Richard. So congratulations to you on that. Before I answer that question, I'm going to give a little anecdote that I think is going to lead into answering your question. Talking about these flowers and talking about what Richard said so movingly about the importance of 100 days in a lot of Asian American Pacific Islander cultures and in our religions and spirituality. When I interviewed people on both sides of the case for Vincent Chin, I went to people's homes I've interviewed them in person. Every single friends, family, activists, lawyers on both sides, people involved on both sides of the case. Every single person visibly got angry, got upset, started crying. Some even wept. It was as if Vincent had been killed 4 days ago, not almost 40 years ago. And I realized I wasn't seeing people remembering. They were literally reliving what happened. I was witnessing trauma happen right in front of me. And it wasn't just the trauma of being part of a horrific, violent death of someone, of a loved one. It was also in the 1980s being told, guess what? You don't count. You don't count when it comes to the discussion and the conversation on race in this country. Your identity doesn't matter. So when the live press conference happened in Atlanta, where they were saying things like, such as paraphrasing that the killer was having a bad day, that we didn't think it was a racist hate crime, we think it was more sexism and misogyny, where as an Asian American woman, I never experienced sexism and misogyny in America. It is always rooted in racism. So to see all that, I realized 40 years from now, whoever does the book on Atlanta, I'm going to tell you right now, the loved ones of all those 8 people who died, they're going to cry not because they're just because they're reliving the trauma. They're going to be crying because in March of 2021, they were told, you don't count. You don't count when it comes to racism. Your identity doesn't matter. You're a ghost. You don't matter. And we cannot have that. So to go into critical race theory and why this is a dangerous, we're at a very watershed dangerous moment, I think, in our public education is I talked to some trusted PhD professors who specialize in this area. I just want to say, first of all, we are using critical race theory in the wrong way. We're turning it into an inaccurate catchphrase to conveniently fit whatever ideology we have about teaching this type of history in our classrooms. So just to break it down for everyone, number one, critical race theory is taught in college and graduate schools. It's not being taught in kindergarten through the 12th grade. That's like saying you're teaching organic chemistry in the 2nd grade. Secondly, critical race theory is not a curriculum. It is an academic analytical framework mostly taught in graduate school. It is not anti-white. It is not the blame game. It has nothing to do with teaching anyone, college students, kindergarten students, about personal racism. It is examining the intersectionality of history and systemic racism. So now taking a step back to answer how this could affect my book being taught, other books, how things are taught through the K through 12 classrooms, the fact that they are misusing a term that is mostly taught for adults in their early to late 20s, even 30s, PhD students, it's being used in the wrong way, and it is being used as a political talking point, which I find very disturbing because we should not politicize our education. We should be teaching the truth. And just to give you an example, according to the US Census Bureau, Asian American Pacific Islanders, we're the fastest growing demographic, and I have the statistic here. We make up 6% of the population now, or a little bit more. In the next 50 years, we're going to double. We are also, quote, one of the fastest growing racial and ethnic groups among eligible US voters. Let's do the math. Let's do the math. Let's think about this. And I just want to conclude by, I want to quote something from Time Magazine and then wrap up with a little personal anecdote. Time Magazine had a really good article about why Asian American Pacific Islander history is not taught in depth in K through 12. We're lucky if we get a paragraph about the illegal incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. I didn't even know about the Korean War. I had to learn it on my own. That's why I write these books. I don't want kids going to that tiny Asian bookshelf at Barnes & Noble like I had to do in the 1990s. That's unacceptable. That's ridiculous. So what Time Magazine wrote, they quoted a very famous woman named Jean Yu. She has taught Asian American studies for more than 50 years. She wrote, the reason why the full history of Asian Americans has not been incorporated into core US history curricula in K through 12 is because it doesn't portray America in a positive light. K through 12 American history texts reinforce the narrative that Asian immigrants and refugees are fortunate to have been helped and saved by the United States of America. It doesn't talk about our imperialistic wars, done to take Asian wealth and resources, and then the disruption of these Asian lives. And few realize, quote, there is an Asian diaspora, I can never say this word, there is an Asian diaspora here in the US because the US went to Asia first. So to wrap up, I just want to say, growing up, My favorite book as a kid was Charlotte's Web. A lot of the books I loved had white characters. A lot of the history I learned was about white America and nothing about me. So if you look, I actually went back when I went to visit my family, and I happened to see drawings I had as a child. When you first see it, when I'm 4 or 5 years old, I have black hair. I have my little glasses. I completely identify as a Korean American little girl. You get older, the drawings start to change into my horror. I started seeing pictures that I drew with me with blonde hair and blue eyes. I became a ghost. And we have to teach critical race theory, not only in our college and graduate school system, but we should teach history through the lens of our systemic racism in our government. And we cannot ignore that. Otherwise, these flowers will never bloom in Richard's film, and these souls will never rest in Atlanta or for Vincent's family and loved ones.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely right. And thank you for sharing that, particularly explaining to the audience what critical race theory is. I do think it is thrown around. It's a good soundbite, right? It's easy to talk about, and it's a scary sounding word or scary sounding phrase. But listening to what Richard said and Paula, what you said, really shows progress in some senses, but then the lack of progress, or maybe even a move backwards in others. So Peggy, you were really a huge part of that first tent post that Richard talked about. You mounted firsthand challenges to institutional racism, fighting in the Supreme Court for the constitutional rights of Min Yasui, alongside Fred Korematsu in the World War II Japanese curfew case. There's certainly no question that those were tough fights, often in front of unfriendly or even hostile parties. That was in 1983. How has the fight changed in the nearly 40 years since then? Are the challenges that we face today, in your opinion, easier or harder to tackle?
Or maybe more of the same story. Back in 1983, when we filed those petitions for writ of error coram nobis in January, it was 6 months after Vincent Chin was killed. So that's one frame of reference. There was no National Asian Bar. There was no Asian Bar of Oregon. There were very few Asian American lawyers. I was 5 years out of law school when we filed that case. And it was challenging, but we also had a smoking gun. We had the general of the Western Defense Command say in a report that the Japanese race is an enemy race, that a Jap is a Jap, and you can't sever the ties of loyalty by migration. It doesn't matter how long we take, you can't separate the goats from the sheep. So the whole theory of military necessity was turned on its head as we saw these documents in the National Archives that the government had, the government attorneys had, and did not present to the US Supreme Court. So we really felt it was a suppression of evidence. And later in the Hirabayashi case, the attorney who wrote the briefs for Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui on the government side testified on our behalf and said that ultimately we essentially lied to the US Supreme Court. Now that was a person who had some courage, because there's a lot of other people that knew that. So what we didn't necessarily have in terms of numbers of Asian American lawyers and community members, we made up, I think, by our anger and our commitment to get this right. I think today, to me, it's the same theme, a different tune, but the same story, which is we're perpetually foreign. We are connected to the countries of our ancestry. That when the murderer in Atlanta says, "Well, it's really not a hate crime," then the cop says, "Well, it's not a hate crime." I mean, taking the word of a white person over the victims, and also seeing us as a group versus seeing white people as individuals. I think those are some of the same things that have happened. seeing that Japanese Americans are the same as Japanese nationals, that and today seeing people today who are quote foreign because they're Asian American. But I think today we have a moment to turn into a movement. And we have people like Paula and Richard who can help with that process, which is because media is really important. So there are similarities. I think it's the same thing on a different note on the same theme, but I think we can turn the corner here. But we have to believe that we are not almost white. We have to believe we're not the model minority. We have to believe and understand about white supremacy if we're going to turn that corner and make this movement.
Yeah, very, very, very well said, Peggy. And, you know, even as you were speaking, I heard almost an exact echo that I didn't pick up on before, but the police taking the word of the white shooter saying, you know, it wasn't race driven, and taking that sounds a lot like the Vincent Chin judge who said, these aren't people who need to go to jail. They said they're good people, they're fine. You know, that echo is definitely there. The other thing that I think, you know, we've touched on today, but haven't talked about directly is that there is this continual thread of being a perpetual foreigner. And when you read the statement from the U.S. military, it was premised exactly on that, right? It was just it was expounding on that very principle, that falsity. But yet there's this other piece, right, which is you're perpetually foreign, but yeah, you're fine. You're not really a minority group or a marginalized group. You don't really need anything special like civil rights protection. And it's that dichotomy that I think is very unique to the AAPI community. So you've all talked about momentum and turning this, these moments into momentum. I'd like to hear from all of you on what you think it will take. And you've mentioned some things in terms of education, media, telling the story, making sure that it's not forgotten. But what are some concrete steps that we can take, that the audience can take to permanently change the dynamic and the perception of Asians in this country? I like your hopeful tone, Peggy, and I tend to agree with you, but I'd like to leave this audience with your thoughts on how they actually do that. So maybe Richard, if I can start with you.
Yeah, Timothy, I think, look, in the last year, we've seen over 6,600 hate incidents as reported to stop AAPI hate, 6,600. We have also seen, at least by my estimations and calculations, looking at the census, over 200,000 babies born in America that happen to look like us, over 200,000. And I think our objective, our hope, as has been echoed by Peggy and Paula and you, is that in 10 years, when they open up their history books or a book written by Paula Yu, that they will see that this was remembered. We must be thinking of that 10 years from now, that we had a response, that this happened, and that there was no response cannot be in the history books. For those 200,000 10-year-olds, that will be AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. And so I think our obligation and our way of getting there is to do the big things, the really big things, and we can do it. Where are the historical landmarks that we need to remember in this great country, where those who happen to be Asian American and Pacific Islander background, Asian American Pacific Islander, that they contributed to this country? For instance, just yesterday, the New York City Preservation Commission, for the very first time, has now a landmark that remembers those who are Chinese Americans. And if there's one city that's had a long history of Asian American Pacific Islanders, it is New York City. The first time yesterday, the World War II veteran, Benjamin Ralph Kimlau, and his war memorial that sits there in Chatham Square. It is now a New York City landmark for the first time. That's what we need more of. Of all of our great 50 amazing origin countries plus, and our cultures and our languages. And this is really not only for the 200,000 AAPIs that were born in our country in the last year of hate, it is for the 94% to join us. Come along. We get it. We're in the 6%. We're learning, right? We're learning our 22, 23 million as you count it. But we want the other 94% to be with us, to stand out there and celebrate these landmarks. A march on the mall. That is symbolic, as Peggy, you were saying, a child of the 60s, but boy, there's an expert then who knows how to march. It would be you, Peggy. I happened to be at Berkeley when we were marching for Rodney King as a peace march. And those are super important. These are the markers of a community that is embraced and respected and loved. So march on the mall when you ask about what can we do in the future. And why not? Why not have that great museum that stands somewhere in Washington, D.C.? That building that says this is the history of Asian American Pacific Islanders in our country. So I think this is the opportunity to really go big. Let's go there. Let's shoot for it, and we can do it. It's just going to take some time, but we have to do it for those 200,000 Asian American Pacific Islanders that are not even a year old right now.
Absolutely. And Paula, I want to segue to you on the same question. What can we do? But I'd love if you could focus more on the youth. Do you think that the youth of this country, Asian, Black, Latino, the 94%, as Richard said, who's going to get involved? Are they going to, what's the social justice movement going to look like in the hands of this new generation?
Well, no, that's a great question. And we hear a lot about how history keeps repeating itself. These hateful incidents, these incidents of racism keep repeating itself. I would argue that history doesn't repeat itself. Racism never went away. It's always been here. But what actually repeats are the continued moments of fighting back. You know, going back to the strikes in the 1800s, some of the first union strikes by Chinese miners and railroad, the fact that you had the Chinese and the Black communities in solidarity in the Mississippi Delta during the 19th century. Vincent Chin and the 1980s, the emergence of the term Asian American going from being a college campus activist term to being a mainstream term that even grandmas and grandpas and aunties and uncles were like, I'm Asian American. So we have always been fighting back. I would say with today's youth is, I think what actually is encouraging is that we have social media, we have technology, because when I interviewed Helen Zia, she's amazing. I just look up to her. She was so proud in 1983 that she got the latest electric typewriter. You know, they had elderly people hand out, literally holding out. This was their tweet. They were handing out pieces of paper. One person makes a difference. So today, I think with teenagers and young people today, you've got the whole world at your literal fingertips. You know, you don't have to print out stuff off your electric typewriter. I could tweet right now and reach, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that that's a great power. And with that power comes great responsibility. So I think young people really need to learn how to use social media to the best possible way. Think about the strategic missile strikes that Helen Zia and Jim Shimura and Roland Wong and Peggy and all, the older generations that we look up to, what they did as well. And and then there was one other thing I wanted to say about this. Oh, I think also too, I think with the young generation, it's not just vote. It's speak out at your high school PTA association. Find out who your local city council person is. What are their stance? What's their stance on critical race theory? How does the person who represents you in your district or your congressperson or your senator, how do they feel about paying teachers and librarians more so they don't have to use their own personal money to buy my book, to buy school supplies and stuff? You can start at a very local grassroots level. One person can make a difference at donate to not just the ACLU and the larger groups, donate here to Georgia, to this organization, to your local activist organization, your nonprofit that's been around for decades. And I think that that's what inspired me when I interviewed Helen and Jim and Roland and all the activists that fought for Vincent Chin's justice. They were just 1 or 2, 3 people, and they did so. It's all you need is to reach one person.
That's right. Yeah. Terrific. Thank you. And Peggy, I will come back to you on this, but we are running a little bit behind on time. There's so much to talk about with all of you, and your answers have been so thought-provoking and terrific, but we'll circle back. In the meantime, I did want to make sure that we're able to give away 2 autographed books from Richard and 2 from Paula. We're very thankful to have them and want to make sure that our audience, we get them in our audience's hands. So I think we've got a random drawing from all the participants. Let's see here. We got the wheels spinning. All right, so we've got the winners of these books: Lindy Freeman, Shinji Morikuma, Mina Ree, and Ivory Brown. So congratulations, winners. Our GAPABA team will be in touch on logistics. We'll make sure they get sent to your house, but congratulations. So we had some great questions come in from the audience, and I want to make sure while we have this group that we try to address as many as we can. One question, Peggy, maybe I could direct this toward you. Can you tell us, some of us who aren't very familiar with Vincent Chin's death, what were the community efforts in rallying that were mobilized following his death? Where were the big demonstrations? Was there a march in DC? Help us get caught up on that.
There wasn't a march in DC, but what Roland and Jim and Helen and others did was they formed an organization called American Citizens for Justice, ACJ. And with that, as Paula was talking about, they galvanized the community in Detroit. And then, they had contacts all over the country, so other people started protesting and marching. And it did force the Department of Justice to file suit, a prosecution, not a civil suit, a criminal suit against these 2 people. And that was unheard of before. So did it go around the country? Yes, it did. And as Paula said, we did it by typewriter, telephone, and tin cans, and not email, text, and messages. But it was pretty amazing. I just remember the time and how strongly the people in Detroit stood tall and stood for a long time.
Thank you. Next question, and Richard, would love your perspective on this. Our audience member writes, how do we change the narrative about Asian Americans? And I think this part, we've talked about that, but this part is very thought-provoking. What should the new narrative be?
Yeah, thanks, Timothy. And it's a big question. I would say, first off, to the anonymous questioner, that what should the narrative be? That there are way too many narratives of this community. Way too many, not in a negative way, but in order to simplify. The AAPI community, as I was mentioning earlier, has 50 plus origin countries. If America was a pizza and cut into 20 slices, we're one slice, and then you take that one slice and divide that slice into 50 pieces. And you can just imagine that if there were ever to be a horrible Thanksgiving dinner opportunity, it would be all of us getting together because there's just so many different types of everything. I say that jokingly just to say that it is a super intersectional community. And how do you lean in on that? Start to read Next Shark, start to read NBC Asian America. Go read those. Just do it for fun. Do it once a week. Just get a sense of what we're going through and what we are. And that'll be better than asking myself, Richard, so what's happening in the Asian American community? Or what's a great restaurant? Those things don't quite work out so well. do something like that. Just read every once in a while. That's a way you can kind of get the sense of the narrative. We are not the model minority, as was said by Peggy and Paula. That is a derogatory. Google it, understand it, and never use it. And you want to find out what it is so you understand why you shouldn't. It basically develops the dynamic of a good minority model and therefore a bad minority. There is no such thing as a bad minority. There is no idea of one being good either. And if this group were to be the good minority, we're all the good stuff. We're all the promotions to the boardroom. We're all the well-paying jobs as you get it to the higher echelons because you've accomplished so much. Where is the situation where you're not spit on, attacked, and pushed randomly because you're seen as not being human? That doesn't sound like model to me. So look, I say this with great passion, Timothy. This is not with anger, is with some frustration, but I think this opportunity, and I really thank the questioner for asking what should the narrative be, because yeah, it's a tough question. Me, as an AAPI and as a journalist, I've struggled with it, but what I continue to do is to try to draw the parallels to other communities where we already understand culturally. Atlanta, as Reverend Al Sharpton said, is the AAPI community's Bloody Sunday. And if you can remember those sorts of things, that will help us to move forward.
Great answer. Thank you. Last question, and because of the time, and I do want to hear from all three of you. So 10-second answers. Tough, but you can do it. And it's a great question. Why is it important for Asian Americans to be allies with other people of color? Is it important for Asian Americans to align with, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement? Remember, 10 seconds. Peggy, starting with you.
We either stand for justice together or we die alone.
Excellent. Paula?
Hashtag solidarity. Black lives, as Korean people say, Black lives are precious.
Excellent. Richard?
We must understand all of our differences, celebrate them so we can celebrate our sameness.
Thank you so much. Those are terrific. You provided terrific and thoughtful insight. Thank you for your answers. I've learned a lot. I know that the audience has learned a lot. And I also know that it's that we didn't have a lot of time. So I think you piqued their curiosity, hopefully. And they're going to go to the resources all of you mentioned. Some of you wrote, and they're going to read them. And we're going to come back together and talk about this more. This is not a one and done. I hope this is the beginning of a longer dialogue and conversation. So I just want to thank all of you for participating. It's been very, very meaningful to me. It's been a true honor to share a virtual stage with you. So thank you.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
Turn this over to Angela for a couple of closing remarks and also some announcements.
Yeah, thank you all. That was amazing. I mean, really amazing. I'm watching some of the comments on Facebook Live. People are like, oh my God. So yeah, we've had some great webinars. GAPABA has some great webinars. This is probably my favorite. No disrespect to all the other speakers, but this is really my favorite. And this is it's our tentpole moment, as Richard had said. And so all of you guys just go out and do your thing, speak and read and engage, because I think that it's on all of us to move forward. So we have some announcements. If you're in the Atlanta area, the State Bar of Georgia Young Lawyers Division is showing Who Killed Vincent Chin this coming Saturday, June 26, 8 p.m. at the Strand Theater on Marietta Square. And also, I think I saw an announcement that Aldif is also showing it virtually. Also, please check out Richard Louie's very special documentary short, Remember the Flowers, Atlanta Shootings, 100 Days, which is being released actually tomorrow to remember the victims' families of the Atlanta shootings. And I want to thank everyone for attending. We've got one more, I think we've got one more of each book to give away. who are final two winners. Sujo. Is that the Sujo I know and love? I hope so. Sujo. And who else? Lonnie Wong. Oh my God. Two
Feels a little bit like home cooking on that one. I'm a little concerned.
Not rigged. Thank you all for attending. Yeah, that's right. So wonderful books. I hope you guys enjoy them. They're terrific books. And I wanted to give a last thank you to our co-sponsors, to NAPABA, our national organization, to NACA Atlanta, to, of course, Bonnie Yoon, who's a wonderful communications and production person, and Jeannie Lin, who also was a co-producer on this, who does an amazing job. Thank you all very much. And one more last announcement. I hope you guys will join us for GAPABA, the return of GAPABA's gala on September 30th. We're very excited. We're going to have a live, in-person, big gala like we're used to. So thank you all so much for attending today. Great, great panel. Thank you all. See you in September.